المعارك لا تتوقف ونيران الجيش السوري في الريف الشمالي هي سيدة الموت.
انطلق الجيش العربي السوري في معركة حلب.
صباح النصر والعز والفخر والاعتزاز بالانتصارات والإنجازات التي يخطها رجال
Backed by Russian air power, the government forces are inching towards Aleppo city.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. We're breaking with our usual format this week in order to dig into the media story in Syria. The dateline that's monopolizing the coverage these days is Aleppo. Half of the city has been in rebel hands, but pro-government forces are advancing, and the United Nations has warned that as many as 300,000 people could be victims of a Sarajevo-like siege, cut off from food supplies and humanitarian aid. After more than 4 years of fighting, multiple rounds of failed diplomacy, and a protracted multilateral propaganda war, there is Syria fatigue in the media world on the part of both journalists and news consumers. But make no mistake, this story is not getting old, it's getting worse. Before we get to some of the complexities in the coverage, we want to start this week where we usually end, with a brief video that's gone viral, drone footage from the city of Homs last month. Homs was called the capital of the revolution. It's been a key battleground, and it has the scars to prove it. This video was produced by Russia Works, a news outlet affiliated with the Russian state broadcaster. Shortly after it was posted, the footage was reposted by Channel 4 News in the UK, which said the destruction was caused by pro-government forces trying to take back an opposition stronghold. Russia Works characterized it differently, focusing instead on the extremist nature of the opposition forces in Homs. And that is just one small example of how differently this story is being told depending on who is telling it. But the pictures don't lie. The degree of destruction is shocking, and the fear is that Aleppo could be left to look like Homs, a city in ruins. Here at The Listening Post, we've been chronicling the way the story in Syria has been reported. And when you spool through more than 4 years' worth of coverage, you find yourself entangled in a spider's web of news narratives. A civil war fought along factional and sometimes religious lines. A geopolitical proxy war that threatens to, if not escalate, then further destabilize the Middle East, as well as a refugee crisis, the scale of which Europe has not witnessed since World War II. For foreign journalists, this has been a war that's been hard to cover. Access has been tough to get, the risk is often too great, and some have paid with their lives. Inside Syria, the coverage reflects the various fault lines between the Assad government and numerous opposition factions. In the past few weeks, as government forces, emboldened by Russian airstrikes, have advanced on Aleppo, the government propaganda machine has been reinforcing its rhetoric of military decisiveness, celebrating rebel losses and glossing over civilian casualties, as well as making the larger point that Syria is under attack by outside forces, that the Assad government is fighting one of those wars on terror, so-called. On Syria's state-controlled media, Aleppo and the advance of government forces towards the city, parts of which are rebel-held, is a story told through images and words, carefully chosen and often repeated.
Their main aim is military decisiveness, al-hasm al-askari in Arabic. That's the phrase they use over and over again. So they'll show you footage of villages that have been liberated by the Syrian army.
اليوم بسواعد أبطالنا أبطال الجيش العربي السوري المقاومون الأبطال
They really almost entirely ignore the question of casualties and refugees, mostly because, I mean, it's pretty obvious why, right?
Whenever there's a battle over territories, specifically very important locations such as Homs or Aleppo, this is very much the narrative. It is seen as a nationalist battle to regain sovereignty and territory from others who are occupying it. We saw on television army generals going to Aleppo raising the Syrian flag. It is the notion that basically Aleppo will return to the homeland. This is basically what is at stake in this battle, according to Syrian media.
This has been called a proxy war, with outside powers aligned with dueling armies inside Syria. Some media outlets act as the proxy's proxy. State-funded channels from Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Qatar have all, to varying degrees, been accused of reflecting their patron government's stances through their coverage of the story. And Western news channels have exposed some of their own biases, dwelling on concerns over civilian casualties when Russian planes started bombing Syria after giving that same issue short shrift when the planes doing the bombing came from NATO countries.
يحاول الجيش السوري استعادة السيطرة على كل منهما. الخطة اعتمدت في البداية على فصلهما عن بعضهما البعض.
Then there are channels like Al Mayadeen and Al Manar, based next door in Lebanon, aligned with the Assad government, beaming their signals and narratives into Syria.
So I watched Al Mayadeen today, and I saw a lot of coverage of a suicide attack in Damascus. That was their main story.
كمية المتفجرات على ما يبدو كبيرة لدرجة كما يظهر في عمق الصورة.
I watched Al Jazeera today, and I find the main story is not really Damascus. It's a refugee crisis and refugees entering Turkey. So another big difference between these channels is that Al Mayadeen, because it is kind of close to the regime, they have a lot of reporters on the ground all over Syria. And Al Jazeera is kind of handicapped by that because they can't enter Syria. And most Western journalists, for that matter, they're not really covering Syria, they're not on the ground anymore.
But then, for example, you have outlets that are involved with Hezbollah, such as Al Manar, right? Al Manar is the Hezbollah TV station. And because Hezbollah fighters are involved in the battlefield alongside the Syrian army, they also are essentially pro-government.
انهيار متواصل للإرهابيين في ريف حلب.
Recently, since September, really, you've had a major ramp-up of the presence of RT, both in its English version and the Arabic one. Right? Different channels that are essentially Russian, of course, but they now broadcast from Syria, on the side of the government, on the side of the opposition. To a certain extent, you have Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Arabiya, and of course, one shouldn't forget Orient News, which is really a very pro-opposition outlet.
التجاهل والتعامي الدولي عما يحصل في سوريا من قتل ودمار وتهجير.
So Syria is a proxy battlefield, and that's reflected in the media landscape as well.
I think Orient today is the only prominent news network that actually covers Syria intensively, like 24/7, and we have so many reporters on the ground.
نشاهد حاليا هذا القصف العنيف الذي تعرضت له منطقة بيانون وهذا الدمار الهائل الذي سببته طائرات العدوان الروسي على.
Since the beginning of the Syrian revolution, people definitely have lost a lot of trust, I think, in the international media in general, because a lot of the media outlets were always casting doubts about reports that are coming from the inside of Syria. However, the people inside of Syria have experienced the atrocities firsthand, and they know that the world is not really showing or reflecting the truth.
Many words can be used to describe the propaganda that goes out on Syrian state TV. Sophisticated is not one of them. The messaging and imagery are heavy-handed. The state is not above using children to make its point.
Keep your hands off Syria!
And the music evokes memories of Soviet-era propaganda, which makes a certain kind of historical sense. In fact, between the audiovisual techniques and the terminology, Damascus has been schooled in both Moscow and Washington.
And this also goes back to historic relations between Syria and Russia, which is seen as a country that opposes Europe, the US, and Israel. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of Syrian directors and media professionals were educated in the Soviet Union before, so a lot of the Syrian official media has been modeled in a way on this Soviet style of reporting.
The terminology is very important here. So a lot of the groups that are fighting the government get lumped together as terrorists or takfiri. So this word takfiri is used a lot. And the word terrorist, I think it's very interesting the way that Arab regimes, I think, have used the word terrorist as much as the Bush administration used that term.
It is quite ironic that before 2011, a lot of Arab governments actually pressured Western countries to define terrorism, having an ambiguous definition of terrorism, stereotypes Arabs because it describes everyone as a terrorist. But this Western narrative of battling terrorism has been adopted in Syria, but also in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt. Each country uses this terminology of terrorism and the war against terrorism to suit its own interests.
Which would not be the issue it is if news organizations didn't simply adopt a government's terminology and make it their own, as so many of them have. One cannot critique journalism in Syria without referring to the safety factor. Since 2011, 88 journalists have been killed there. Some caught in the crossfire, but many others targeted, including those victimized, beheaded, for the most vile of propaganda purposes. Not many journalists are willing to go, and who can blame them? This war has killed hundreds of thousands and chased millions from their homes. They are the real victims. But given the way the story's been reported, the media and journalism also bear the wounds, many of them self-inflicted.
Journalism, especially after the Syrian conflict, there's a big question mark about, first of all, the independence of news outlets all over the world, about how much the world actually is responsible to do to protect and assure journalists that they can continue doing their job, that there's going to be some sort of protection. And I think that even when the Syria war is over, this is something that the world should look into and talk about the role of media.
Basically, all these outlets are now tainted with the issue of bias, right? And this again applies to both pro-opposition and pro-government. Both sides have been tainted by the notion that they are not neutral. No, they were out there cheering on a side. This has also occurred for a lot of Western outlets as well. I mean, it's not original on my part to say that the truth is the first victim of war, obviously, right? But I would say, the reliability of the different outlets is another victim of this. I think people will emerge from this with much more cynicism, much less trust in their outlets, even ones that outwardly have no relationship to any one state. The fact is now that people will not trust any outlet. And honestly, I wouldn't either.
On the download now, our viewers weigh in on the coverage of the fighting in Syria.
If you're in Syria today, you would feel how the story reported on the state's media, how disconnected it is from reality. This has created a huge gap between Syrians and the media, and it pushed them to search for other sources of news. This has not only brought plurality and diversity of voices, but also brought authenticity and social responsibility to the Syrian media landscape. This emerging media scene came from dire need for free, independent, unbiased, and non-politicized voices, but it also came from the desire to speak freely and independently.
In a moment, we'll look at some Syrian news outlets that are operating in exile. Many alternative news sources have been spawned by this war, but given the amount of journalistic bias in both new media and mainstream outlets, it's a case of buyer beware. Starting in the pro-Assad corner, as we reported in the piece, the main players being the state-owned channel Syrian TV and Al-Akhbariyya Al-Saudiya. Sana, the state-owned news agency, also churns out pro-government news. There are news outlets in neighboring Lebanon that also factor in. Al-Mayadeen TV is pro-Assad. It's believed to be bankrolled by Iran and Rami Makhlouf, a Syrian businessman and a cousin of President Assad. The Hezbollah-controlled Al-Manar TV is also sympathetic to the Assad government and Iran. It broadcasts out of South Beirut and into Syria. President Assad does few television interviews. The fact he did one with Al-Manar last year is telling. On the opposition side, the Sham News Network, or SNN, was created by a group of US-based Syrian activists. It's registered in the US, but says it relies on correspondents in Syria. Its website publishes in Arabic and English. The outlet has more than 2 million followers on Facebook. Ana Press was founded by Rami Jarrah, a Syrian political activist turned war reporter, originally based in Damascus, now operating out of southern Turkey. Radio Ana broadcasts Syrian news into the rebel-held areas of the north. 2 months ago, Ana made headlines when its journalists reported from civilian areas of Aleppo, disputing Russian claims that their bombers were only hitting areas held by ISIL.
There are no terrorists here. Why are the Russians attacking these places?
Then there's the Enab Baladi newspaper that started life on the outskirts of Damascus in 2011 before it was shut down by government forces a year later. It, too, has moved to southern Turkey and claims to have a print run of 7,000 papers, which, according to its site, are distributed inside Syria, in Aleppo, Latakia, and Idlib. It was 5 years ago next month that the first demonstrations took place in Damascus that would eventually bring the country to a state of civil war. Syrian journalists have been documenting what many still call the revolution, providing the basics of news that Syrians can use, where the front lines have shifted, the effect of the fighting on the price of gasoline, what goods and necessities are in short supply and where to get them, as well as death notices, whose sons and daughters were killed in last night's airstrikes. Some of the most useful Syrian news outlets are now based in southern Turkey, in cities such as Gaziantep and Urfa, beyond the line of fire that can be just a border crossing away. However, that border and a life in exile is no guarantee of protection from a movement such as ISIL that is intolerant of journalists and is willing to kill to get its message across. The Listening Post's Will Young now on some of the Syrian journalists who got out and are sending the news back in.
A weekday morning in Syria. Anyone who needs to make a journey might be advised to tune in to Hawa Smart Radio's daily program, كيف الطريق القصير, or How's the Road.
We broadcast a simple yet effective morning program called How's the Road. It alerts people to the most dangerous roads or if new checkpoints have appeared in the area. We tell people where there are skirmishes so people don't use that route. We give people this simple information which is relevant to their lives.
In between power outages, Syrians might tune in to Aleppo Today to get the latest on the war, reports on public services, or to see the daily roll call of the dead.
As a channel, we're not interested in international news. What we care about is news happening locally, in Syria. We focus on the average citizens, those who can't find fuel for heating, those who have no food, those suffering under airstrikes.
في هذا الطفل تتلخص حكاية مئات العائلات في ريف حلب الغربي.
We are also the #1 source for documenting the dead and the martyrs among civilians in Aleppo province. People from Aleppo call us to complain when we do not report on their relatives.
Almost all Syrian alternative media have been working on what's called media services or public information, trying to give information about things that can improve their daily lives. Different prices of basic necessities in different regions. Information about where are the hospitals, where are the doctors.
وريف حماة قام مركز أمراض الدم الوراثية أو ما يعرف بالثلاسيميا.
Many of the media outlets serving Syrians today are based in Gaziantep in southern Turkey, where a quarter of Turkey's nearly 2 million Syrian refugees have found a temporary home. Gaziantep has become a hub for NGOs and civil society groups, and it's also a natural centre for Syrian journalists to maintain links with their homeland.
Gaziantep is one of the most important communication centers for Syrians. It has good facilities and it's close to the Syrian border. We have daily communication with more than 100 reporters spread out over Syria. We have employees who go into Syria every day. It's easy for us to move in and out of Gaziantep.
We left Aleppo primarily for security concerns, as we were being hunted by government forces. Here in Turkey, it's the government's responsibility to protect us. But still, we keep our office address anonymous. No signs, announcements, or anything to reveal our location. That way, we stay under the radar.
Gaziantep is just 4 hours' drive from Raqqa, the city ISIL has declared the capital of its so-called Islamic State. Raqqa was also the birthplace of a group of citizen journalists whose very reason for existing is contained in its name, RBSS. Raqqa is being slaughtered silently.
RBSS is a campaign to document the atrocities committed by ISIL in the city of Raqqa. We started RBSS in 2014, and within 2 weeks, ISIL announced that they would kill anybody that worked for us. ISIL has turned parts of Raqqa into hell, but tries to portray Raqqa as heaven. We publish a parody of the official ISIL magazine aimed at young people. With these simple tools, we've had a positive impact, stopping people joining ISIL.
RBSS, Raqqa is being slaughtered silently. They're very brave people. They have been the only one to work on the violations of ISIS in Raqqa. Now they're in a difficult situation. End of last year, there was 2 journalists from the group who have been beheaded by ISIS. The big change has been the assassination of Nabih Bulos. And since then, everything has changed. The people are trying to leave Gaziantep. People don't feel safe anymore. All the journalists feel targeted.
Gaziantep and other cities on the Turkey-Syrian border, such as Urfa, have become a hub for Syrian media organizations. But security is poor. Working in this area has become impossible. There are daily threats. They can get to us from anywhere. We have now left Urfa and Gaziantep, and nobody knows where we are. We work in secret, safe locations that are unknown to others. I've been in Berlin more than a year and a half now. For me, danger is everywhere, even in Germany.
When Syrians rose up against Bashar Assad in 2011, journalists began to contest the government narrative. Now, with the rise of ISIL and a multitude of other militant groups, as well as the involvement of foreign powers, the Syria story has become ever more complex. And the journalism required to tell it has evolved.
I worked at Syrian state TV for around 14 years, but I didn't feel like a real journalist. We couldn't speak unless we got permission from the intelligence services and the Syrian army. So after leaving in 2013, we felt a great need to say things that we couldn't really say all those years. When I'm on air, I can't be anything but professional. We observe journalistic standards because you can't counter regime misinformation with revolutionary rhetoric. So there's no contradiction between Zoya the activist and Zoya the journalist.
Aleppo Today is an independent channel, but we're definitely in opposition and not with the regime. The old state media was politicized, a mouthpiece for the regime. But there is no point rejecting the regime's propaganda just to create revolutionary propaganda. With the revolution has come the possibility of establishing independent media affiliated with neither the regime nor the opposition.
Before 2011, before the revolution, I was a regular university student. I used to hang out in the cafeteria, and politics never entered my mind. My life was very normal. It was the situation that forced us to get involved in politics and the media, forcing us to become citizen journalists. I don't like to call myself an activist or a journalist. I'm a citizen of Raqqa. I'm Syrian. This is a duty we're performing for our city.
Syrian journalists come with their own personal narratives. Citizen reporters who started out chronicling a revolution now find themselves confronting militants who themselves use the media to achieve their goals. Journalists who once worked for Syria's government have shaken off state censorship and are now telling a different story. If there is a common thread, it's the shared hope that one day they will return and report the Syrian story from Syria.
As of now, like so many Syrians, those journalists are a long way from home. You've been watching a special edition of our program on Syria and the coverage of the story. We're back next week with our usual format. We'll see you then here at the Listening Post.